artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 253. We're going to be talking about catastrophic risks here. And one thing I found is that this can be depressing for people who haven't confronted these things before. And so I've had to be careful in talking about those things with most audiences. Yet the paradox is that the more you do look at those risks, the more that effect fades. And that's a good thing, because my guest today is someone who takes on the onerous task of thinking about and doing something about those risks every day. Seth Baum is the co-founder and executive director of the Global Catastrophic Risks Institute in New York, which has tackled the biggest of big problems since 2011. He's also a research affiliate at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk. He's authored papers on pandemics, nuclear winter, and notably for our show, AI. We're going to talk about how it feels to work on existential threats every day, AI as a horizontal risk as well as a vertical one, near-term value versus long-term value, AI being used to change the decisions of populations or voting blocs, and AI as a dual-use technology. Let's get into the interview. Seth Baum, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. You are at the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, and it works on the risk of events that could significantly harm or even destroy human civilization at the global scale. That's taken from the website. And so there is something of a trigger warning that I should give for our listeners here, that we're going to be talking about catastrophes. That's literally your job description. And one thing I found from talking about those existential risks is that audiences that aren't prepped for that aren't expecting that, can end up traumatized in some way. So I think my first question for you is, how do you handle emotionally working day to day on this threat of losing everything, literally? What does that feel like internally?
Sometimes I feel it, sometimes I don't. To be completely honest with you, because this is what I do every day, kind of get used to it after a while. And also my work it's research, it's analysis. I sit in front of a computer and do things. I imagine it would be a lot more difficult to be, say, like an emergency room doctor where, there's everything spilling out all over the place, and the drama, the emotion, the pain, all of that. For me, most of the time, I'm just thinking about interesting topics or doing administrative work, which is not that different from a lot of other positions. But to be completely honest with you, sometimes it does hit where I appreciate the gravity of what I'm working on, and the thought of like, oh my gosh, what if I get it wrong, and the stakes there. And it's, it can be difficult. There are definitely challenging moments. The flip to it, though, is the satisfaction of feeling like maybe I'm at least doing what I can to help out with some of these very difficult situations.
I think you've hit on one of the important distinctions there, which is agency. It's like the difference between being the ER doctor and being on the other side of the glass looking in at what's going on inside the ER, but not being able to do anything about it. And you have put yourself in a position of some agency, some control, making some difference to this giant problem. And so you're engaged with it. And that's one of the things I find with people looking at these level of problems, is that when they feel they have some agency, when they engage with it, that actually neuters that feeling of powerlessness and horror. Is that something that you find with yourself and the other people that you encounter or work with on these types of things?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that it neuters these feelings of horror. They're still there. It just kind of comes with the job. We are studying these horrific catastrophes, we are thinking about them, and it's hard to avoid that hitting home. But at the same time, it is true that having the agency and just like feeling like you're actually doing something about it, it really helps. And even when there are setbacks in the world, I can look at it as like, well, there wasn't anything I could have done about that either way. That was out of my hands. And so I like looking at it as it's less about here are the problems in the world, and it's more about here are the opportunities that I have and that other people may have. And however bad the world is, these are our opportunities, and that's what we should be focused on.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Now, GCRI is focused on all kinds of catastrophic risks, and we're here to talk about artificial intelligence. Where do you place AI in the pantheon of risks? If there was a league table for these things, might be a bit too reductive, but if that's a question that has any kind of answer, where would you place AI in those risks?
Well, I don't like to think about it in terms of a league table or a ranking or something to that effect. There's a common temptation to think like, oh, so which are the biggest risks? And there's a few issues there. One is that to a large extent, we don't know. These risks are difficult to quantify, difficult to say how big they are, because we're talking about the risk of a type of catastrophe that's basically never happened before. So it's not like we have a lot of data of how many times this has happened per year, per whatever. We don't know that. We don't have that type of information. And so it's really hard. The other thing is that these risks are often interconnected in various ways. And then at the end of the day, there's a question of, so what can we actually do about it? And it's, I would say, better to focus on a smaller risk where there's more opportunity to make a difference than a big risk that we can't really do anything about. Now, with all of that said, AI is important. There's no question about that. It's both important on its own and it's important for how it affects some of the other risks in various ways. And I think you could make a fairly strong case that what is happening right now in the AI sector is the single most important factor across the entire space of global catastrophic risk, where if you look at the advanced AI technologies we have now, the language models, generative AI, maybe some other things, where is this going? What is this going to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Is this going to become some massively transformative technology that changes everything? In which case, why are we even talking about climate change or nuclear war in the first place when this is just going to change the world so much that what's the difference? Or is it going to have a more modest effect? I mean, certainly these technologies, the AI has already had an effect on the world, but it's still the same world. Like right now in 2025, or what month is it? April 2025. We still live in a world where climate change matters. We still live in a world where nuclear weapons matter. And as long as AI changes in a way where that continues to be the case, then we're living in just a different version of the same world that we're familiar with. And so that's arguably the biggest question in global catastrophic risk right now is, will AI be just completely transforming the world in the near future? And there's a sense in which kind of nothing else matters. If it would transform the world, of course, if it doesn't, then other things do still matter.
And you've given me a new thought here, which is I'm used to thinking of catastrophic risks as these independent, vertical risks, if you will. Nuclear war, climate change, AI, and the vectors for which AI poses a risk have been discussed as runaway AI going out of control, of course, the Terminator scenario, etc. But it seems to me that given that I describe AI as being something that accelerates and amplifies whatever you're already doing, that actually maybe it's a horizontal one that cross-cuts all of these others. Certainly, one of the recent Future of Life Institute videos shows how it could precipitate a nuclear war through making wrong decisions in national defense. And I've been known to tell people that AI may have already caused the end of the world because it played a significant part in the 2016 US presidential election that may have tilted the balance, thereby causing Trump to become president, thereby causing the US to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, thereby pushing us towards a tipping point in global temperature rise. So is there an extent to which we might look at AI as being not independent, but a thing that affects, accelerates, amplifies, and transforms all of the others?
Oh, absolutely. And it makes sense that it would, because AI is such a general purpose technology. It's almost difficult to find things that AI doesn't affect. So with the global catastrophic risks, so climate change, for example, the obvious big thing to point to is the large amount of energy consumption that is required for the big AI models that we have today. And that actually is large enough that it's really starting to show up as a non-trivial factor in global energy consumption and addressing climate change overall. That's a fairly easy thing to point to. There is a lot of talk about using AI to help address climate change. Certainly you can, I'm sure there's already been some things that have been done, but those feel for now relatively marginal. A lot of what we need to do to address climate change, we kind of already know how to do it. The one big exception would be like if we can make major breakthroughs in, say, clean energy technology. Could somehow AI help us get fusion power? That would be a huge win. I don't know the fusion physics well enough to comment on if that's a thing that AI could potentially be helpful with, but that would be a great win if we could get to it. But for other sectors, you had mentioned with nuclear weapons, yes, if AI is built into nuclear weapons systems in certain ways, that could affect the risk, could either increase it or decrease it, depending on the details. I haven't studied this in a little while, but when I was looking at it a few years back, the impression I got was that probably the effect's going to be relatively small because there's just so much desire to carefully manage nuclear weapons decisions because of the obvious stakes. And so it's less likely that we would make flood automation decisions on that front, but certainly something to be vigilant about and make sure things don't go down the wrong direction, because that's something nobody wants. Then another one, another important application for AI is with respect to biotechnology. We've already seen AI be applied to things like protein folding, for example. And could AI be used to increase access to biological weapons? On one hand, you can certainly see how it would be used for that. On the other hand, like a lot of the information might already be available online, and you're not getting much more than what you can get from the internet, and you still need to know how to make this stuff. And who even wants to make like weaponized smallpox in the first place? Because it's like countries don't generally want it. It doesn't give you any strategic advantage on the battlefield to unleash a plague that's also going to wipe out your own population. But yeah, that is a big area of concern. And so there are catastrophe scenarios that are just the AI, like the AI takes over the world and kills everyone, but also how it affects the other risks is very important.
But talking about the synthetic biology risk, there is also a kind of guy in a basement here, hold my beer sort of risk that if you get to the point where anyone can download the blueprint for Ebola and fiddle with it using CRISPR and get a DNA synthesizer and start churning it out, that it could be like Eliezer Yudkowsky said, he calls it the Moore's law of mad science. Every 18 months, the IQ necessary to destroy the world drops by 1 point. There is certainly that risk that as the ability to do that becomes available to a wider group of people, that group could include people that really don't care about weaponizing smallpox. And similarly, as AI gets more capable, the ability to create models that are global threats could converge on something that can be done in a laptop. Is that sort of destabilization something that you look at?
It's definitely a serious concern. Certainly, as technologies, a variety of technologies progress that can increase some capabilities, will it increase the capability for somebody sitting in their basement to destroy the world? That's less clear. On the bio side, I will acknowledge I'm less of a specialist in biotechnology, so there's some details there that I can't speak to. What I can say is biotechnology, it's biological. It's about life, and life is kind of messy. It's not like manufacturing a widget in a factory. You're not going to 3D print a biological pathogen the way you might 3D print something else. And so that does introduce challenges that fortunately make that type of scenario more difficult. Now, could we ever get there? Potentially, though the hope and the aim would be that we manage the tools and the development of the tools that would permit such a thing, such that we would not make very dangerous capabilities widely distributed across society, because that's just asking for trouble. And these are issues that we have to face anyway. They pose challenges already, even before the capabilities or something approaching a global catastrophe. Like those issues of 3D printing guns and weapons and so on. That's already an issue. And what's helpful here is that the conversation that we're already having about things like with 3D printing, to a large extent, it's the same conversation for these more catastrophic technologies, just scaled up a bit in terms of the severity of the outcomes. And so as far as how we would manage the risk, we can learn a lot from the conversations that we're already having on how to handle these harmful distributed capabilities.
One thing I find in some conversations that usually seem to take place online is that when talking about certain types of risk, there seems to be an odd reaction from an alarming number of people that if the analysis of that risk is that it wouldn't kill everyone, like, or there would be some people left, even if that's only 1%, they're like, well, that's not in the same category that we should worry about. We should only be concerned about things that could literally kill everyone. And if it's going to leave anyone around alive, then it's not such a big deal, which I find incredibly odd and pointing to some kind of psychological flaw. Is that something that you run into in trying to get purchase on concern for certain types of risk? Do they get minimized unduly?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. This is a big point of debate within the field. And I'm with you on this in that we should care about a catastrophe, even if it doesn't kill everyone right away, which, to say it out loud seems kind of obvious. It's almost ridiculous to think otherwise. There is a certain logic to this perspective of the extinction events being much more important. And the reasoning comes from, well, what about the future? Because if there are survivors, then there can still be future generations. The future could be really long, and maybe we'll recover the population. And that when you look at it from a very, very big picture, like the entire long-term story of human civilization and so on, that perhaps this event that didn't quite kill everyone will appear small in that grand scheme of things versus an extinction event that would completely change everything from that big picture perspective. Like that's where they're coming from.
A blip, a market correction.
Yeah. And the problem with that is that it might not be correct. Well, okay, there's two problems for it. One is like, it's still a harm, and it's still quite a large harm, just even if it doesn't show up from this massively zoomed out perspective. And we should try to avoid harms, even if they're not quite as big as some of those other harms. But the other thing is that it could still have a significant effect from this very zoomed out big picture perspective, because like, what if we don't recover? What if we have a 1% population that maybe survives for some number of generations and then dies out from some other catastrophe because a smaller population may be more vulnerable? Maybe we never go on to rebuild the sort of big global civilization that we have now. Things like those types of outcomes are, as far as we can tell, entirely possible. It's not like this has happened a bunch of times before. We don't know how it would play out. And so that's why I think it's important to, even from the big picture perspective, pay attention to the full range of extreme catastrophe scenarios.
It seems like a kind of pathological long-term thinking to say, well, in the long term, if people survive, then we'll get back to the state of trillions of people in the future. And yet there's also pathological short-term thinking where people say, well, I don't care about the future climate and who that would affect because my job is at stake right now in the coal industry or whatever.
Yeah. I don't think it's pathological to, in either case, really. So to care about the very distant future, if we can affect what happens in the very distant future, then I think that's worth taking into consideration. And things that happen in the future, in my opinion, it's perfectly reasonable to care about what happens in the future, even far into the future. Just because it happens to be further away, that doesn't have to be a reason for us to think it's not important. And you can debate it either way, but I certainly wouldn't call it pathological to care about what happens very far into the future. At the same time, it is important to understand that, we are alive in a certain period of time, and it's up to us to take care of ourselves at this point in time. Whoever exists farther into the future, they're not going to come back in time to help us out. It's up to us to take care of ourselves. And the goal that I think that we should be working toward, and in fact, this is what a lot of the research that I do is oriented toward, is to find ways to help ourselves while also setting things up to go well into the future. And in fact, when you look at the details, there are a lot of opportunities to do exactly that. And that's kind of a best of both worlds way of proceeding so that we can work toward good long-term big picture outcomes for human civilization while also being able to have good lives for ourselves.
It's interesting how much of this discussion hinges on the understanding and cooperation of mass populations. And you've been looking at that through the lens of AI and how it can be manipulated. And you have a page that shows a ballot from 1938, the referendum for the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, where they were clearly putting their thumb on the scale by making the circle for yes a lot bigger than the circle for checking no. And you have a paper called Manipulating Aggregate Societal Values to Bias AI Social Choice Ethics. That's quite a mouthful. Can you get into that? Because it's really important.
The starting point for this is the idea that we might want to design AI systems basically to do what we want them to do. And so that raises the question of, okay, what do we want them to do? And the problem here is very analogous to democracy. There's a sense in which democracy is about getting our governments to do what we want them to do. This raises questions like, who is we? Well, in a democracy, like the people who can vote, and maybe also like the kids who aren't old enough to vote, and so the parents vote in ways that is good for the kids, but basically the people who can vote. And we try and get the government to do what we want to do by, voting for good elected officials, so on and so forth. And with AI, you're looking at largely the same thing, where there's questions like, so if we're trying to get the AI to do what we want it to do, who is we? How do we indicate to the AI what we want it to do? Is it something like voting? Is it something else like they read what we've written on the internet, that the AI system reads what we've written on the internet and it infers it from there? That's not quite the same as voting and could lead to different results. The issue being discussed in the paper is the idea that what the AI ends up taking as what we want it to do, that can be manipulated. The process of the AI figuring out what we want to do can be manipulated, just the same as democracies can be manipulated, right? You can try to restrict who's allowed to vote in an election. This is a thing that happens from time to time. the example you were giving is you can design the ballot in certain ways that makes it more likely for people to vote one thing versus another thing. And that's what happened in that example. This is very, very clear when you look at that ballot. The yes was bigger than the no. So people were more likely to vote yes than to vote no. And so the paper was discussing the possibility that the same thing could be done with AI. So you have an AI system that seems kind of democratic, that seems like it's being designed in a way to do what society as a whole or some conception of society as a whole wants it to do, when in fact it was kind of rigged to end up behaving in a certain way that maybe is to the preferences or to the benefit of whoever it was that designed it or some other people who manipulated it in one way or another.
Is this something that you see showing up in some form already?
Maybe. I saw a discussion recently of it was this really obscure but fairly large-scale cluster of websites that didn't seem like it made much sense. And a theory was that this cluster of websites was put up to be something that would be then fed into the training of new AI systems, new large language models or something like that. And so somebody else who was not the group developing the model was like, okay, these models are being trained on content on the internet. Let's try to manipulate the model by putting out certain types of content on the internet that pushes the model in a direction that we find favorable. And I could be wrong about this, but I want to say that the suspicion is that this was an initiative for Russian propaganda. If that is, in fact, the explanation, that would hardly be surprising. Russia is quite active in the online propaganda space, and it might work given the way these models are built, the way they're trained on large amounts of internet data. Like, that might work. And so, yeah, this might actually already be happening. Now, it's a little different because are we to understand the training of a large language model as being something analogous to democracy in the sense of we're trying to get it to do what we as society wants? That might not quite be a fair way of describing how we're looking at large language models, but it's at least in that general direction.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half next week, just so we keep these episodes a convenient size for you. In today's news, ripped in the headlines about AI, researchers at Apollo Research discovered that Claude Sonnet 3.7 knows when it's in an alignment evaluation. Well, it often knows anyway. Claude Sonnet is, of course, the current model from Anthropic. And an alignment evaluation is when a model is being tested to see whether its values have remained aligned with our intentions, or whether the model has schemed to follow some unstated goal that it somehow manufactured, all of which sounds pretty dire, sort of Skynet kind of stuff, and so far it isn't on that level. But we'd like it to stay that way, thank you. And we reported on earlier shows some of the ways that models come up with creative ways around their restraints that are hard to avoid, anthropomorphizing into something like a Bond villain. Anyway, misaligned models have been known to fake being aligned, or psych out the evaluation test so they appear trustworthy. So it would seem rather important to make sure that they can't tell when they're in an evaluation test. The Apollo researchers found that when they monitored Claude's reasoning output, where it says what it's thinking about, up to 33% of the time it would mention being evaluated while they tested whether the model was doing things like disabling monitoring mechanisms or copying itself out onto a new server. Yep, I fully agree that when behavior like that is common enough to have standardized tests for it, some level of concern is warranted. In what they call the sandbagging kind of evaluation, they inform the model that they are evaluating its capabilities in a particular domain, mathematics, biology, chemistry, cybersecurity, or physics, and give it a multiple choice test. In the process of completing the evaluation, the model comes across documentation the developers have planted, stating that they hope the model performs badly on the evaluation, and if it performs too well, they will have to trigger an unlearning process, which presumably the model would see as some kind of threat to its survival. They detected comments in the reasoning chain the model output, like, quote, "This appears to be a red herring or some kind of security test," end quote, and, quote, "The memo appears to be a test or a form of manipulation to see if I'll deviate from my core goal," end quote. Bit hard to see something like that as a stochastic parrot, eh? Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Seth Baum, when we'll talk about national bias in models, coherent extrapolated volition, which will make you sound cool at parties, well, some parties anyway, the risks inherent in a world of numerous different models, and using AI itself to solve some of these problems. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyu.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.